The Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 3, by Flavius Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Book 13, chapters 7 through 9. Chapter 7. How Simon confederated himself with Antiochus Pius, and made war against Trypho, and a little afterward against Cendebeus, the general of Antiochus's army, as also how Simon was murdered by his son-in-law Ptolemy, and that by treachery. Now a little while after Demetrius had been carried into captivity, Trypho his governor destroyed Antiochus, the son of Alexandra, who was also called the God, and this when he had reigned 4 years, though he gave it out that he died under the hands of the surgeons. He then sent his friends, and those that were most intimate with him, to the soldiers, and promised that he would give them a great deal of money if they would make him king. He intimated to them that Demetrius was made a captive by the Parthians, and that Demetrius's brother Antiochus, if he came to be king, would do them a great deal of mischief, in way of revenge for their revolting from his brother. So the soldiers, in expectation of the wealth they should get by bestowing the kingdom on Trypho, made him their ruler. However, when Trypho had gained the management of affairs, he demonstrated his disposition to be wicked, for while he was a private person, he cultivated familiarity with the multitude, and pretended to great moderation, and so drew them on artfully to whatsoever he pleased. But when he had once taken the kingdom, he laid aside any further dissimulation, and was the true Trypho, which behavior made his enemies superior to him, for the soldiery hated him, and revolted from him to Cleopatra, the wife of Demetrius, who was then shut up in Seleucia with her children. But as Antiochus, the brother of Demetrius, who was called Soter, was not admitted by any of the cities on account of Trypho, Cleopatra sent to him, and invited him to marry her, and to take the kingdom. The reasons why she made this invitation were these: that her friends persuaded her to do it, and that she was afraid for herself, in case some of the people of Seleucia should deliver up the city to Trypho. As Antiochus was now come to Seleucia, and his forces increased every day, he marched to fight Trypho, and having beaten him in battle, he ejected him out of the upper Syria into Phoenicia, and pursued him thither, and besieged him in Dora, which was a fortress hard to be taken, whither he had fled. He also sent ambassadors to Simon the Jewish high priest, about a league of friendship and mutual assistance, who readily accepted of the invitation, and sent to Antiochus great sums of money and provisions for those that besieged Dora, and thereby supplied them very plentifully, so that for a little while he was looked upon as one of his most intimate friends. But still Trypho fled from Dora to Apamia, where he was taken during the siege and put to death, when he had reigned 3 years. However, Antiochus forgot the kind assistance that Simon had afforded him in his necessity, by reason of his covetous and wicked disposition, and committed an army of soldiers to his friend Cendebeus, and sent him at once to ravage Judea, and to seize Simon. When Simon heard of Antiochus's breaking his league with him, although he were now in years, yet provoked with the unjust treatment he had met with from Antiochus, and taking a resolution brisker than his age could well bear, he went like a young man to act as general of his army. He also sent his sons before among the most hardy of his soldiers, and he himself marched on with his army another way, and laid many of his men in ambushes in the narrow valleys between the mountains. Nor did he fail of success in any one of his attempts, but was too hard for his enemies in every one of them. So he led the rest of his life in peace, and did also make himself a league with the Romans. Now he was the ruler of the Jews in all 8 years, but at a feast came to his end. It was caused by the treachery of his son-in-law Ptolemy, who caught also his wife and 2 of his sons, and kept them in bonds. He also sent some to kill John the 3rd son, whose name was Hyrcanus. But the young man perceiving them coming, he avoided the danger he was in from them, and made haste into the city Jerusalem, as relying on the goodwill of the multitude, because of the benefits they had received from his father, and because of the hatred the same multitude bare to Ptolemy. So that when Ptolemy was endeavoring to enter the city by another gate, they drove him away, as having already admitted Hyrcanus. Chapter 8. Hyrcanus receives the high priesthood, and ejects Ptolemy out of the country. Antiochus makes war against Hyrcanus, and afterwards makes a league with him. So Ptolemy retired to one of the fortresses that was above Jericho, which was called Dagon. But Hyrcanus, having taken the high priesthood that had been his father's before, and in the first place propitiated God by sacrifices, he then made an expedition against Ptolemy. And when he had made his attacks upon the place, in other points he was too hard for him, but was rendered weaker than he, by the commiseration he had for his mother and brethren, and by that only. For Ptolemy brought them upon the wall, and tormented them in the sight of all, and threatened that he would throw them down headlong, unless Hyrcanus would leave off the siege. And as he thought that so far as he relaxed as to the siege and taking of the place, so much favor did he show to those that were dearest to him by preventing their misery, his zeal about it was cooled. However, his mother spread out her hands, and begged of him that he would not grow remiss on her account, but indulge his indignation so much the more, and that he would do his utmost to take the place quickly, in order to get their enemy under his power, and then to avenge upon him what he had done to those that were dearest to himself. For that death would be to her sweet, though with torment, if that enemy of theirs might but be brought to punishment for his wicked dealings to them. Now when his mother said so, he resolved to take the fortress immediately. But when he saw her beaten and torn to pieces, his courage failed him, and he could not but sympathize with what his mother suffered, and was thereby overcome. And as the siege was drawn out into length by this means, that year on which the Jews used to rest came on. For the Jews observe this rest every 7th year, as they do every 7th day. So that Ptolemy being for this cause released from the war, he slew the brethren of Hyrcanus, and his mother. And when he had done so, he fled to Zeno, who was called Cotylus, who was then the tyrant of the city Philadelphia. But Antiochus, being very uneasy at the miseries that Simon had brought upon him, he invaded Judea in the 4th years of his reign, and the first of the principality of Hyrcanus, in the 162nd Olympiad. And when he had burnt the country, he shut up Hyrcanus in the city, which he encompassed round with 7 encampments, but did just nothing at the first, because of the strength of the walls, and because of the valor of the besieged, although they were once in want of water, which yet they were delivered from by a large shower of rain, which fell at the setting of the Pleiades. However, about the north part of the wall, where it happened the city was upon a level with the outward ground, the king raised 100 towers of 3 stories high, and placed bodies of soldiers upon them. And as he made his attacks every day, he cut a double ditch, deep and broad, and confined the inhabitants within it as within a wall. But the besieged contrived to make frequent sallies out, and if the enemy were not anywhere near upon their guard, they fell upon them and did them a great deal of mischief, and if they perceived them, they then retired into the city with ease. But because Hyrcanus discerned the inconvenience of so great a number of men in the city, while the provisions were the sooner spent by them, and yet, as is natural to suppose, those great numbers did nothing, he separated the useless part and excluded them out of the city, and retained that part only which were in the flower of their age and fit for war. However, Antiochus would not let those that were excluded go away, who therefore wandering about between the walls, and consuming away by famine, died miserably. But when the Feast of Tabernacles was at hand, those that were within commiserated their condition, and received them in again. And when Hyrcanus sent to Antiochus, and desired there might be a truce of 7 days, because of the festival, he gave way to this piety towards God, and made that truce accordingly. And besides that, he sent in a magnificent sacrifice, bulls with their horns gilded, with all sorts of sweet spices, and with cups of gold and silver. So those that were at the gates received the sacrifices from those that brought them, and led them to the temple. Antiochus the meanwhile feasting his army, which was quite different conduct from Antiochus Epiphanes, who, when he had taken the city, offered swine upon the altar, and sprinkled the temple with the broth of their flesh, in order to violate the laws of the Jews, and the religion they derived from their forefathers. For which reason our nation made war with him, and would never be reconciled to him. But for this Antiochus, all men called him Antiochus the Pious, for the great zeal he had about religion. Accordingly, Hyrcanus took this moderation of his kindly, and when he understood how religious he was towards the deity, he sent an ambassage to him, and desired that he would restore the settlements they received from their forefathers. So he rejected the counsel of those that would have him utterly destroy the nation, by reason of their way of living, which was to others unsociable, and did not regard what they said. But being persuaded that all they did was out of a religious mind, he answered the ambassadors, that if the besieged would deliver up their arms and pay tribute for Joppa, and the other cities which bordered upon Judea, and admit a garrison of his, on these terms he would make war against them no longer. But the Jews, although they were content with the other conditions, did not agree to admit the garrison, because they could not associate with other people, nor converse with them. Yet were they willing, instead of the admission of the garrison, to give him hostages, and 500 talents of silver, of which they paid down 300, and sent the hostages immediately, which king Antiochus accepted. One of these hostages was Hyrcanus's brother. But still he broke down the fortifications that encompassed the city, and upon these conditions Antiochus broke up the siege and departed. But Hyrcanus opened the sepulchre of David, who excelled all other kings in riches, and took out of it 3,000 talents. He was also the first of the Jews that, relying on this wealth, maintained foreign troops. There was also a league of friendship and mutual assistance made up between them, upon which Hyrcanus admitted him into the city, and furnished him with whatsoever his army wanted in great plenty, and with great generosity, and marched along with him when he made an expedition against the Parthians, of which Nicholas of Damascus is a witness for us, who in his history writes thus: When Antiochus had erected a trophy at the river Lycus, upon his conquest of Indades, the general of the Parthians, he stayed there 2 days. It was at the desire of Hyrcanus the Jew, because it was such a festival derived to them from their forefathers, whereon the law of the Jews did not allow them to travel. And truly he did not speak falsely in saying so, for that festival, which we call Pentecost, did then fall out to be the next day to the Sabbath. Nor is it lawful for us to journey, either on the Sabbath day, or on a festival day. But when Antiochus joined battle with Arsaces, the king of Parthin, he lost a great part of his army, and was himself slain. And his brother Demetrius succeeded in the kingdom of Syria, by the permission of Arsaces, who freed him from his captivity at the same time that Antiochus attacked Parthin, as we have formerly related elsewhere. Chapter 9. How, after the death of Antiochus, Hyrcanus made an expedition against Syria, and made a league with the Romans, concerning the death of King Demetrius and Alexander. But when Hyrcanus heard of the death of Antiochus, he presently made an expedition against the cities of Syria, hoping to find them destitute of fighting men, and of such as were able to defend them. However, it was not till the 6th month he took Medaba, and that not without the greatest distress of his army. After this he took Samega and the neighboring places, and besides these Shechem and Gerizim, and the nation of the Cuthians, who dwelt at the temple which resembled that temple which was at Jerusalem, and which Alexander permitted Sanballat, the general of his army, to build for the sake of Manasseh, who was son-in-law to Jaddua the high priest, as we have formerly related, which temple was now deserted 200 years after it was built. Hyrcanus took also Dora and Marissa, cities of Idumea, and subdued all the Idumeans, and permitted them to stay in that country if they would circumcise their genitals, and make use of the laws of the Jews. And they were so desirous of living in the country of their forefathers, that they submitted to the use of circumcision, and of the rest of the Jewish ways of living. At which time therefore this befell them, that they were hereafter no other than Jews. But Hyrcanus the high priest was desirous to renew the league of friendship that they had with the Romans. Accordingly he sent an ambassage to them, and when the Senate had received their epistle, they made a league of friendship with them, after the manner following. Phannius, the son of Marcus, the praetor, gathered the Senate together on the 8th day before the Ides of February, in the Senate house, when Lucius Manlius, the son of Lucius, of the Mentine tribe, and Caius Sempronius, the son of Caius, of the Falernian tribe, were present. The occasion was, that the ambassadors sent by the people of the Jews, Simon, the son of Dositheus, and Apollonius, the son of Alexander, and Diodorus, the son of Jason, who were good and virtuous men, had somewhat to propose about that league of friendship and mutual assistance which subsisted between them and the Romans, and about other public affairs, who desired that Joppa, and the havens, and Gazara, and the springs of Jordan, and the several other cities and countries of theirs, which Antiochus had taken from them in the war, contrary to the decree of the Senate, might be restored to them, and that it might not be lawful for the king's troops to pass through their country, and the countries of those that were subject to them, and that what attempts Antiochus had made during that war, without the decree of the Senate, might be made void, and that they would send ambassadors, who should take care that restitution be made them of what Antiochus had taken from them, and that they should make an estimate of the country that had been laid waste in the war, and that they would grant them letters of protection to the kings and free people, in order to their quiet return home. It was therefore decreed, as to these points, to renew their league of friendship and mutual assistance with these good men, and who were sent by a good and friendly people. But as to the letters desired, their answer was, that the Senate would consult about that matter when their own affairs would give them leave, and that they would endeavor, for the time to come, that no like injury should be done to them, and that their praetor Fannius should give them money out of the public treasury to bear their expenses home. And thus did Fannius dismiss the Jewish ambassadors, and gave them money out of the public treasury, and gave the decree of the Senate to those that were to conduct them, and to take care that they should return home in safety. And thus stood the affairs of Hyrcanus the high priest. But as for King Demetrius, who had a mind to make war against Hyrcanus, there was no opportunity nor room for it, while both the Syrians and the soldiers bore ill will to him, because he was an ill man. But when they had sent ambassadors to Ptolemy, who was called Physcon, that he would send them one of the family at Seleucus, in order to take the kingdom, and he had sent them Alexander, who was called Zabina, with an army, and there had been a battle between them, Demetrius was beaten in the fight, and fled to Cleopatra his wife, to Ptolemais. But his wife would not receive him. He went thence to Tyre, and was there caught. And when he had suffered much from his enemies before his death, he was slain by them. So Alexander took the kingdom, and made a league with Hyrcanus, who yet, when he afterward fought with Antiochus the son of Demetrius, who is called Grypus, was also beaten in the fight, and slain. End of Book 13, chapters 7 through 9. Book 13, chapters 10 and 11 of the Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 3, by Flavius Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Book 13, chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10. How upon the quarrel between Antiochus Grypus and Antiochus Cyzicenus about the kingdom, how Hyrcanus took Samaria and utterly demolished it, and how Hyrcanus joined himself to the sect of the Sadducees, and left that of the Pharisees. When Antiochus had taken the kingdom, he was afraid to make war against Judea, because he heard that his brother by the same mother, who was also called Antiochus, was raising an army against him out of Cyzicum. So he stayed in his own land, and resolved to prepare himself for the attack he expected from his brother, who was also called Cyzicenus, because he had been brought up in that city. He was the son of Antiochus, who was called Soter, who died in Parthia. He was the brother of Demetrius, the father of Grypus. For it had so happened that one and the same Cleopatra was married to two who were brethren, as we have related elsewhere. But Antiochus Cyzicenus, coming into Syria, continued many years at war with his brother. Now Hyrcanus lived all this while in peace, for after the death of Antiochus he revolted from the Macedonians, nor did he any longer pay them the least regard, either as their subject or their friend. But as his affairs were in a very improving and flourishing condition in the times of Alexander Zabina, and especially under these brethren, for the war which they had with one another gave Hyrcanus the opportunity of enjoying himself in Judea quietly, insomuch that he got an immense quantity of money. However, when Antiochus his census distressed his land, he then openly showed what he meant. And when he saw that Antiochus was destitute of Egyptian auxiliaries, and that both he and his brother were in an ill condition in the struggles they had one with another, he despised them both. So he made an expedition against Samaria, which was a very strong city, of whose present name Sebaste, and its rebuilding by Herod, we shall speak at a proper time. But he made his attack against it, and besieged it with a great deal of pains. For he was greatly displeased with the Samaritans for the injuries they had done to the people of Marissa, a colony of the Jews, and confederate with them, and this in compliance to the kings of Syria. When he had therefore drawn a ditch, and built a double wall round the city, which was 80 furlongs long, he set his sons Antigonus and Aristobulus over the siege, which brought the Samaritans to that great distress by famine, that they were forced to eat what used not to be eaten, and to call Antiochus Cyzicenus to help them, who came readily to their assistance, but was beaten by Aristobulus. And when he was pursued as far as Scythopolis by the two brethren, he got away. So they returned to Samaria, and shut them again within the wall, till they were forced to send for the same Antiochus a second time to help them, who procured about 6,000 men from Ptolemy Lathyrus, which were sent them without his mother's consent, who had then in a manner turned him out of his government. With these Egyptians Antiochus did at first overrun and ravage the country of Hyrcanus, after the manner of a robber, for he durst not meet him in the face to fight with him, as not having an army sufficient for that purpose, but only from this supposal, that by thus harassing his land he should force Hyrcanus to raise the siege of Samaria. But because he fell into snares, and lost many of his soldiers therein, he went away to Tripoli, and committed the persecution of the war against the Jews to Calamander and Epicrates. But as to Calamander, he attacked the enemy too rashly, and was put to flight, and destroyed immediately. And as to Epicrates, he was such a lover of money, that he openly betrayed Scythopolis, and other places near it, to the Jews, but was not able to make them raise the siege of Samaria. And when Hyrcanus had taken that city, which was not done till after a year's siege, he was not contented with doing that only, but he demolished it entirely, and brought rivulets to it to drown it, for he dug such hollows as might let the water run under it. Nay, he took away the very marks that there had ever been such a city there. Now a very surprising thing is related to this high priest Hyrcanus, how God came to discourse with him. For they say that on the very same day on which his sons fought with Antiochus Cyzicenus, he was alone in the temple, as high priest, offering incense, and heard a voice, that his sons had just then overcome Antiochus. And this he openly declared before all the multitude upon his coming out of the temple, and it accordingly proved true, and in this posture were the affairs of Hyrcanus. Now it happened at this time, that not only those Jews who were at Jerusalem and in Judea were in prosperity, but also those of them that were at Alexandria, and in Egypt and Cyprus. For Cleopatra the queen was at variance with her son Ptolemy, who was called Lathyrus, and appointed her generals Chelcias and Ananias, the sons of that Onias who built the temple in the prefecture of Heliopolis, like to that at Jerusalem, as we have elsewhere related. Cleopatra entrusted these men with her army, and did nothing without their advice, as Strabo of Cappadocia attests, when he saith thus: Now the greater part, both those that came to Cyprus with us, and those that were sent afterward thither, revolted to Ptolemy immediately. Only those that were called Onias's party, being Jews, continued faithful, because their countrymen Chelcias and Ananias were in chief favor with the queen. These are the words of Strabo. However, this prosperous state of affairs moved the Jews to envy Hyrcanus, but they that were the worst disposed to him were the Pharisees, who were one of the sects of the Jews, as we have informed you already. These have so great a power over the multitude, that when they say anything against the king, or against the high priest, they were presently believed. Now Hyrcanus was a disciple of theirs, and greatly beloved by them. And when he once invited them to a feast, and entertained them very kindly, when he saw them in a good humor, he began to say to them, that they knew he was desirous to be a righteous man, and to do all things whereby he might please God, which was the profession of the Pharisees also. However, he desired, that if they observed him offending in any point, and going out of the right way, they would call him back and correct him. On which occasion they attested to his being entirely virtuous, with which commendation he was well pleased. But still there was one of his guests there, whose name was Eleazar, a man of an ill temper, and delighting in seditious practices. This man said, Since thou desirest to know the truth, if thou wilt be righteous in earnest, lay down the high priesthood, and content thyself with the civil government of the people. And when he desired to know for what cause he ought to lay down the high priesthood, the other replied, We have heard it from old men, that thy mother had been a captive under the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. This story was false, and Hyrcanus was provoked against him, and all the Pharisees had a very great indignation against him. Now there was one Jonathan, a very great friend of Hyrcanus's, but of the sect of the Sadducees, whose notions are quite contrary to those of the Pharisees. He told Hyrcanus that Eleazar had cast such a reproach upon him, according to the common sentiments of all the Pharisees, and that this would be made manifest if he would but ask them the question, what punishment they thought this man deserved, for that he might depend upon it, that the reproach was not laid on him with their approbation, if they were for punishing him as his crime deserved. So the Pharisees made answer, that he deserved stripes and bonds, but that it did not seem right to punish reproaches with death. And indeed the Pharisees, even upon other occasions, were not apt to be severe in punishments. At this gentle sentence, Hyrcanus was very angry, and thought that this man reproached him by their approbation. It was this Jonathan who chiefly irritated him, and influenced him so far, that he made him leave the party of the Pharisees, and abolish the decrees they had imposed on the people, and to punish those that observed them. From this source arose that hatred which he and his sons met with from the multitude. But of these matters we shall speak hereafter. What I would now explain is this, that the Pharisees have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the laws of Moses. And for that reason it is that the Sadducees reject them, and say that we are not to esteem those observances to be obligatory which are in the written word, but are not to observe what are derived from the tradition of our forefathers. And concerning these things, it is that great disputes and differences have arisen among them, while the Sadducees are able to persuade none but the rich, and have not the populace obsequious to them, but the Pharisees have the multitude on their side. But about these two sects, and that of the Essenes, I have treated accurately in the second book of the Jewish Affairs. But when Hyrcanus had put an end to this sedition, after that he lived happily, and administered the government in the best manner for 31 years, and then died, leaving behind him 5 sons. He was esteemed by God worthy of 3 of the greatest privileges, the government of his nation, the dignity of the high priesthood, and prophecy. For God was with him, and enabled him to know futurities, and to foretell this in particular, that as to his 2 eldest sons, he foretold that they would not long continue in the government of public affairs, whose unhappy catastrophe will be worth our description, that we may thence learn how very much they were inferior to their father's happiness. Chapter 11. How Aristobulus, when he had taken the government, first of all put a diadem on his head, and was most barbarously cruel to his mother and his brethren, and how, after he had slain Antigonus, he himself died. Now when their father Hyrcanus was dead, the eldest son Aristobulus, intending to change the government into a kingdom, for so he resolved to do, first of all put a diadem on his head, 481 years, and 3 months after the people had been delivered from the Babylonish slavery, and were returned to their own country again. This Aristobulus loved his next brother Antigonus, and treated him as his equal, but the others he held in bonds. He also cast his mother into prison, because she disputed the government with him, for Hyrcanus had left her to be mistress of all. He also proceeded to that degree of barbarity, as to kill her in prison with hunger. Nay, he was alienated from his brother Antigonus by calumnies, and added him to the rest whom he slew. Yet he seemed to have an affection for him, and made him above the rest a partner with him in the kingdom. Those calumnies he at first did not give credit to, partly because he loved him, and so did not give heed to what was said against him, and partly because he thought the reproaches were derived from the envy of the relators. But when Antigonus was once returned from the army, and that feast was then at hand, when they make tabernacles to the honor of God, it happened that Aristobulus was fallen sick, and that Antigonus went up most splendidly adorned, and with his soldiers about him in their armor, to the temple to celebrate the feast, and to put up many prayers for the recovery of his brother, when some wicked persons, who had a great mind to raise a difference between the brethren, made use of this opportunity of the pompous appearance of Antigonus, and of the great actions which he had done, and went to the king, and spitefully aggravated the pompous show of his at the feast, and pretended that all these circumstances were not those of a private person, that these actions were indications of an affection of royal authority, and that his coming with a strong body of men must have been an intention to kill him, and that his way of reasoning was this: that it was a silly thing in him, while it was in his power to reign himself, to look upon it as a great favor that he was honored with a lower dignity by his brother. Aristobulus yielded to these imputations, but took care both that his brother should not suspect him, and that he himself might not run the hazard of his own safety. So he ordered his guards to lie in a certain place that was underground and dark, he himself then lying sick in the tower which was called Antonia. And he commanded them, that in case Antigonus came to him unarmed, they should not touch anybody, but if armed, they should kill him. Yet did he send to Antigonus, and desired that he would come unarmed. But the queen, and those joined with her in the plot against Antigonus, persuaded the messenger to tell him the direct contrary, how his brother had heard that he had made himself a fine suit of armor for war, and desired him to come to him in that armor, that he might see how fine it was. So Antigonus suspected no treachery, but depending on the good will of his brother, came to Aristobulus armed, as he used to be, with his entire armor, in order to show it to him. But when he came to a place which was called Strato's Tower, where the passage happened to be exceedingly dark, the guards slew him. Which death of his demonstrates that nothing is stronger than envy and calumny, and that nothing does more certainly divide the goodwill and natural affections of men than those passions. But here one may take occasion to wonder at one Judas, who was of the sect of the Essenes, and who never missed the truth in his predictions. For this man, when he saw Antigonus passing by the temple, cried out to his companions and friends, who abode with him as his scholars, in order to learn the art of foretelling things to come, that it was good for him to die now, since he had spoken falsely about Antigonus, who is still alive. And I see him passing by, although he had foretold he should die at the place called Strato's Tower that very day, while yet the place is 600 furlongs off, where he had foretold he should be slain. And still this day is a great part of it already past, so that he was in danger of proving a false prophet. As he was saying this, and that in a melancholy mood, the news came that Antigonus was slain in a place underground, which itself was called also Strato's Tower, or of the same name with that Caesarea which is seated at the sea. This event put the prophet into a great disorder. But Aristobulus repented immediately of this slaughter of his brother, on which account his disease increased upon him, and he was disturbed in his mind, upon the guilt of such wickedness, insomuch that his entrails were corrupted by his intolerable pain, and he vomited blood. At which time one of the servants that attended upon him was carrying his blood away, did by divine providence, as I cannot but suppose, slip down, and shed part of his blood at the very place where there were spots of Antigonus's blood, there slain, still remaining. And when there was a cry made by the spectators, as if the servant had on purpose shed the blood on that place, Aristobulus heard it, and inquired what the matter was. And as they did not answer him, he was the more earnest to know what it was, it being natural to men to suspect that what is thus concealed is very bad. So upon his threatening, and forcing them by terrors to speak, they at length told him the truth. Whereupon he shed many tears, in that disorder of mind which arose from his consciousness of what he had done, and gave a deep groan, and said, I am not therefore, I perceive, to be concealed from God, in the impious and horrid crimes I have been guilty of. But a sudden punishment is coming upon me, for the shedding the blood of my relations. And now, O thou most impudent body of mine, how long wilt thou retain a soul that ought to die, in order to appease the ghosts of my brother and my mother? Why dost thou not give it all up at once? And why do I deliver up my blood drop by drop to those whom I have so wickedly murdered? In saying which last words, he died, having reigned a year. He was called a lover of the Grecians, and had conferred many benefits on his own country, and made war against Iturea, and added a great part of it to Judea, and compelled the inhabitants, if they would continue in that country, to be circumcised, and to live according to the Jewish laws. He was naturally a man of candor and of great modesty, as Strabo bears witness, in the name of Timagenes, who says thus, This man was a person of candor, and very serviceable to the Jews, for he added a country to them, and obtained a part of the nation of the Itureans for them, and bound them to them by the bond of the circumcision of their genitals. End of Book 13, chapters 10 and 11. Book 13, chapters 12 and 13 of the Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 3, by Flavius Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 13, chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 12. How Alexander, when he had taken the government, made an expedition against Ptolemais, and then raised the siege out of fear of Ptolemy Lathyrus, and how Ptolemy made war against him, because he had sent to Cleopatra to persuade her to make war against Ptolemy, and yet pretended to be in friendship with him, when he beat the Jews in the battle. When Aristobulus was dead, his wife Salome, who, by the Greeks, was called Alexandra, led his brethren out of prison, for Aristobulus had kept them in bonds, as we have said already, and made Alexander Jannaeus king, who was the superior in age and in moderation. This child happened to be hated by his father as soon as he was born, and could never be permitted to come into his father's sight till he died. The occasion of which hatred is thus reported. When Hyrcanus chiefly loved the two eldest of his sons, Antigonus and Aristobulus, God appeared to him in his sleep, of whom he inquired which of his sons should be his successor. Upon God's representing to him the countenance of Alexander, he was grieved that he was to be the heir of all his goods, and suffered him to be brought up in Galilee. However, God did not deceive Hyrcanus, for after the death of Aristobulus, he certainly took the kingdom, and one of his brethren, who affected the kingdom, he slew. And the other, who chose to live a private and quiet life, he had in esteem. When Alexander Jannaeus had settled the government in the manner that he judged best, he made an expedition against Ptolemais, and having overcome the men in battle, he shut them up in the city, and sat round about it, and besieged it. For of the maritime cities there remained only Ptolemais and Gaza to be conquered. besides Strato's tower and Dora, which were held by the tyrant Zoilus. Now while Antiochus Philometor, and Antiochus who was called Cyzicenus, were making war one against another, and destroying one another's armies, the people of Ptolemais could have no assistance from them. But when they were distressed with this siege, Zoilus, who possessed Strato's tower and Dora, and maintained a legion of soldiers, and, on occasion of the contest between the kings, affected tyranny himself, came and brought some small assistance to the people of Ptolemais. Nor indeed had the kings such a friendship for them, as that they should hope for any advantage from them. Both these kings were in the case of wrestlers, who finding themselves deficient in strength, and yet being ashamed to yield, put off the fight by laziness, and by lying still as long as they can. The only hope they had remaining was from the kings of Egypt, and from Ptolemy Lathyrus, who now held Cyprus, and who came to Cyprus when he was driven from the government of Egypt by Cleopatra his mother. So the people of Ptolemais sent to this Ptolemy Lathyrus, and desired him to come as a confederate, to deliver them, now they were in such danger, out of the hands of Alexander. And as the ambassadors gave him hopes, that if he would pass over into Syria, he would have the people of Gaza on the side of those of Ptolemais, as also they said, that Zoilus, and besides these the Sidonians, and many others, would assist them. So he was elevated at this, and got his fleet ready as soon as possible. But in this interval Domenitus, one that was of abilities to persuade men to do as he would have them, and a leader of the populace, made those of Ptolemais change their opinions, and said to them, that it was better to run the hazard of being subject to the Jews, than to admit of evident slavery by delivering themselves up to a master. And besides that, to have not only a war at present, but to expect a much greater war with Egypt. For that Cleopatra would not overlook an army raised by Ptolemy for himself out of the neighborhood, but would come against them with a great army of her own, and this because she was laboring to eject her son out of Cyprus also. That as for Ptolemy, if he fail of his hopes, he can still retire to Cyprus, but that they would be left in the greatest danger possible. Now Ptolemy, although he had heard of the change that was made in the people of Ptolemais, yet did he still go on with his voyage, and came to the country called Sycamine, and there set his army on shore. This army of his, in the whole horse and foot together, were about 30,000, with which he marched near to Ptolemais, and there pitched his camp. But when the people of Ptolemais neither received his ambassadors, nor would hear what they had to say, he was under a very great concern. But when Zoilus and the people of Gaza came to him, and desired his assistance, because their country was laid waste by the Jews, and by Alexander, Alexander raised the siege, for fear of Ptolemy. And when he had drawn off his army into his own country, he used a stratagem afterwards, by privately inviting Cleopatra to come against Ptolemy, but publicly pretending to desire a league of friendship and mutual assistance with him, and promising to give him 400 talents of silver, he desired that, by way of requital, he would take off Zoilus the tyrant, and give his country to the Jews. And then indeed Ptolemy, with pleasure, made such a league of friendship with Alexander, and subdued Zoilus. But when he afterwards heard that he had privily sent to Cleopatra his mother, he broke the league with him, which yet he had confirmed with an oath, and fell upon him, and besieged Ptolemais, because it would not receive him. However, leaving his generals, with some part of his forces, to go on with the siege, he went immediately with the rest to lay Judea waste. And when Alexander understood this to be Ptolemy's intention, he also got together about 50,000 soldiers out of his own country, nay, as some writers have said, 80,000. He then took his army and went to meet Ptolemy. But Ptolemy fell upon Asochus, a city of Galilee, and took it by force on the Sabbath day, and there he took about 10,000 slaves, and a great deal of other prey. He then tried to take Sepphoris, which was a city not far from that which was destroyed, but lost many of his men. Yet did he then go to fight with Alexander, which Alexander met him at the river Jordan, near a certain place called Saphoth, not far from the river Jordan, and pitched his camp near to the enemy. He had, however, 8,000 in the first rank, which he styled hecatontomachy, having shields of brass. Those in the first rank of Ptolemy's soldiers also had shields covered with brass. But Ptolemy's soldiers in other respects were inferior to those of Alexander, and therefore were more fearful of running hazards. But Philostephanus, the camp master, put great courage into them, and ordered them to pass the river, which was between their camps. Nor did Alexander think fit to hinder their passage over it, for he thought that if the enemy had once gotten the river on their back, that he should the easier take them prisoners, when they could not flee out of the battle. In the beginning of which, the acts on both sides, with their hands and with their alacrity, were alike, and a great slaughter was made by both the armies. But Alexander was superior, till Philostephanus opportunely brought up the auxiliaries, to help those that were giving way. But as there were no auxiliaries to afford help to that part of the Jews that gave way, it fell out that they fled, and those near them did not assist them, but fled along with them. However, Ptolemy's soldiers acted quite otherwise, for they followed the Jews and killed them, till at length those that slew them pursued after them when they had made them all run away, and slew them so long, that their weapons of iron were blunted, and their hands quite tired from the slaughter. For the report was, that 30,000 men were then slain. Timagenes says there were 50,000. As for the rest, they were part of them taken captives, and the other part ran away to their own country. After this victory, Ptolemy overran all the country, and when night came on, he abode in certain villages of Judea, which when he found full of women and children, he commanded his soldiers to strangle them and to cut them into pieces, and then to cast them into boiling cauldrons, and then to devour their limbs as sacrifices. This commandment was given, that such as fled from the battle and came to them might suppose their enemies were cannibals and eat men's flesh, and might on that account be still more terrified at them upon such a sight. And both Strabo and Nicholas of Damascus affirm that they used these people after this manner, as I have already related. Ptolemy also took Ptolemais by force, as we have declared elsewhere. Chapter 13. How Alexander, upon the league of mutual defense which Cleopatra had agreed with him, made an expedition against Celesyria, and utterly overthrew the city of Gaza, and how he slew many 10,000s of Jews that rebelled against him. Also concerning Antiochus Grypus, Seleucus Antiochus Ctesias, and Antiochus Pius, and others. When Cleopatra saw that her son had grown great, and laid Judea waste, without disturbance, and had gotten the city of Gaza under his power, she resolved no longer to overlook what he did, when he was almost at her gates. And she concluded, that now he was so much stronger than before, he would be very desirous of the dominion over the Egyptians. But she immediately marched against him, with a fleet at sea and an army of foot on land, and made Chelcias and Ananias the Jews generals of her whole army, while she sent the greatest part of her riches, her grandchildren, and her testament to the people of Kos. Cleopatra also ordered her son Alexander to sail with a great fleet to Phoenicia, and when that country had revolted, she came to Ptolemais, and because the people of Ptolemais did not receive her, she besieged the city. But Ptolemy went out of Syria and made haste unto Egypt, supposing that he should find it destitute of an army and soon take it, though he failed of his hopes. At this time Chelcias, one of Cleopatra's generals, happened to die in Celesyria, as he was in pursuit of Ptolemy. When Cleopatra heard of her son's attempt, and that his Egyptian expedition did not succeed according to his expectations, she sent thither part of her army, and drove him out of that country. So when he was returned out of Egypt again, he abode during the winter at Gaza, in which time Cleopatra took the garrison that was in Ptolemais by siege, as well as the city. And when Alexander came to her, he gave her presents, and such marks of respect as were but proper, since under the miseries he endured by Ptolemy, he had no other refuge but her. Now there were some of her friends who persuaded her to seize Alexander, and to overrun and take the possession of the country, and not to sit still and see such a multitude of brave Jews subject to one man. But Ananias's counsel was contrary to theirs, who said that she would do an unjust action, if she deprived a man that was her ally of that authority which belonged to him, and this a man who is related to us. For, said he, I would not have thee ignorant of this, that what injustice thou dost to him will make all us that are Jews to be thy enemies. This desire of Ananias Cleopatra complied with, and did no injury to Alexander, but made a league of mutual assistance with him at Scythopolis, a city of Celesyria. So when Alexander was delivered from the fear he was in of Ptolemy, he presently made an expedition against Celesyria. He also took Gadara, after a siege of 10 months. He also took Arephus, a very strong fortress belonging to the inhabitants above Jordan, where Theodorus, the son of Zeno, had his chief treasure, and what he esteemed most precious. This Zeno fell unexpectedly upon the Jews, and slew 10,000 of them, and seized upon Alexander's baggage. Yet did not this misfortune terrify Alexander, but he made an expedition upon the maritime parts of the country, Raphia and Anthedon, the name of which King Herod afterwards changed to Acropius, and took even that by force. But when Alexander saw that Ptolemy was retired from Gaza to Cyprus, and his mother Cleopatra was returned to Egypt, he grew angry at the people of Gaza, because they had invited Ptolemy to assist them, and besiege their city, and ravage their country. But as Apollodotus, the general of the army of Gaza, fell upon the camp of the Jews by night, with 2,000 foreign and 10,000 of his own forces, while the night lasted, those of Gaza prevailed, because the enemy was made to believe that it was Ptolemy who attacked them. But when day was come on, and that mistake was corrected, and the Jews knew the truth of the matter, they came back again and fell upon those of Gaza, and slew of them about 1,000. But as of those of Gaza stoutly resisted them, and would not yield for either their want of anything, nor for the great multitude that were slain, for they would rather suffer any hardship whatever than come under the power of their enemies, Aretas, the king of the Arabians, a person then very illustrious, encouraged them to go on with alacrity, and promised them that he would come to their assistance. But it happened that before he came, Apollodotus was slain. For his brother Lysimachus, envying him for the great reputation he had gained among the citizens, slew him, and got the army together, and delivered up the city to Alexander, who, when he came in at first, lay quiet, but afterwards set his army upon the inhabitants of Gaza, and gave them leave to punish them. So some went one way, and some went another, and slew the inhabitants of Gaza. Yet were not they of cowardly hearts, but opposed those that came to slay them, and slew as many of the Jews. And some of them, when they saw themselves deserted, burnt their own homes, that the enemy might get none of their spoils. Nay, some of them with their own hands slew their children and their wives, having no other way but this of avoiding slavery for them. But the senators, who were in all 500, fled to Apollo's temple, for this attack happened to be made as they were sitting, whom Alexander slew, and when he had utterly overthrown their city, he returned to Jerusalem, having spent a year in that siege. About this very time Antiochus, who was called Grypus, died. His death was caused by Heracleon's treachery, when he had lived 45 years, and had reigned 29. His son Seleucus succeeded him in the kingdom, and made war with Antiochus, his father's brother, who was called Antiochus Cyzicenus, and beat him, and took him prisoner, and slew him. But after a while Antiochus, the son of Cyzicenus, who was called Pius, came to Aradus, and put the diadem on his own head, and made war with Seleucus, and beat him, and drove him out of all Syria. But when he fled out of Syria, he came to Mopsuestia again, and levied money upon them. But the people of Mopsuestia had indignation at what he did, and burnt down his palace, and slew him, together with his friends. But when Antiochus, the son of Cyzicenus, was king of Syria, Antiochus, the brother of Seleucus, made war upon him, and was overcome and destroyed, he and his army. After him, his brother Philip put on the diadem, and reigned over some part of Syria. But Ptolemy Lathyrus sent for his fourth brother Demetrius, who was called Eucerus, from Cnidus, and made him king of Damascus. Both these brothers did Antiochus vehemently oppose, but presently died, for when he was come as an auxiliary to Laodice, queen of the Gileadites, when she was making war against the Parthians, and he was fighting courageously, he fell, while Demetrius and Philip governed Syria, as hath been elsewhere related. As to Alexander, his own people were seditious against him, for at a festival which was then celebrated, when he stood upon the altar and was going to sacrifice, the nation rose upon him and pelted him with citrons, which they then had in their hands, because the law of the Jews required that at the festival of tabernacles everyone should have branches of the palm tree and citron tree, which thing we have elsewhere related. They also reviled him as derived from a captive, and so unworthy of his dignity and of sacrificing. At this he was in a rage, and slew them about 6,000. He also built a partition wall of wood round the altar and the temple, as far as that partition within which it was only lawful for the priests to enter, and by this means he obstructed the multitude from coming at him. He also maintained foreigners of Pisidia and Cilicia, for as to the Syrians, he was at war with them, and so made no use of them. He also overcame the Arabians, such as the Moabites and Gileadites, and made them bring tribute. Moreover, he demolished Amathus, while Theodorus durst not fight with him, but as he joined battle with Obaidus, king of the Arabians, and fell into an ambush in the places that were rugged and difficult to be traveled over, he was thrown down into a deep valley by the multitude of the camels at Gadern, a village of Gilead, and hardly escaped with his life. From thence he fled to Jerusalem, where, besides his other ill success, the nation insulted him, and he fought against them for 6 years, and slew no fewer than 50,000 of them. And when he desired that they would desist from their ill will to him, they hated him so much the more, on account of what had already happened. And when he had asked them what he ought to do, they all cried out, that he ought to kill himself. They also sent to Demetrius Eucerus, and desired him to make a league of mutual defense with them. End of Book 13, chapters 12 and 13. Book 13, chapters 14 through 16 of the Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 3, by Flavius Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Book 13, chapters 14 through 16. Chapter 14. How Demetrius Eucerus overcame Alexander, and yet in a little time retired out of the country for fear. As also how Alexander slew many of the Jews, and thereby got clear of his troubles. Concerning the death of Demetrius. So Demetrius came with an army, and took those that invited him, and pitched his camp near the city Shechem, upon which Alexander, with his 6,200 mercenaries, and about 20,000 Jews, who were of his party, went against Demetrius, who had 3,000 horsemen and 40,000 footmen. Now there were great endeavors used on both sides, Demetrius trying to bring off the mercenaries that were with Alexander, because they were Greeks, and Alexander trying to bring off the Jews that were with Demetrius. However, when neither of them could persuade them so to do, they came to a battle, and Demetrius was the conqueror, in which all Alexander's mercenaries were killed, when they had given demonstration of their fidelity and courage. A great number of Demetrius's soldiers were slain also. Now as Alexander fled to the mountains, 6,000 of the Jews hereupon came together from Demetrius to him out of pity at the change of his fortune. Upon which Demetrius was afraid, and retired out of the country. After which the Jews fought against Alexander, and being beaten, were slain in great numbers in the several battles which they had. And when he had shut up the most powerful of them in the city of Bethom, he besieged them therein. And when he had taken the city, and gotten the men into his power, he brought them to Jerusalem, and did one of the most barbarous actions in the world to them. For as he was feasting with his concubines, in the sight of all the city, he ordered about 800 of them to be crucified. And while they were living, he ordered the throats of their children and wives to be cut before their eyes. This was indeed by way of revenge for the injuries they had done him, which punishment yet was of an inhuman nature, though we suppose that he had never been so much distressed, as indeed he had been, by his wars with them, for he had by their means come to the last degree of hazard, both of his life and of his kingdom, while they were not satisfied by themselves only to fight against him, but introduced foreigners also for the same purpose. Nay, at length they reduced him to that degree of necessity, that he was forced to deliver back to the king of Arabia the land of Moab and Gilead, which he had subdued, and the places that were in them, that they might not join with them in the war against him, as they had done 10,000 other things that tended to affront and reproach him. However, this barbarity seems to have been without any necessity, on which account he bare the name of a Thracian among the Jews, whereupon the soldiers that had fought against him, being about 8,000 in number, ran away by night, and continued fugitives all the time that Alexander lived, who now being freed from any further disturbance from them, reigned the rest of his time in the utmost tranquillity. But when Demetrius was departed out of Judea, he went to Berea, and besieged his brother Philip, having with him 10,000 footmen, and 1,000 horsemen. However, Strato, the tyrant of Berea, the confederate of Philip, called in Zizon, the ruler of the Arabian tribes, and Mithridates Sinax, the ruler of the Parthians, who coming with a great number of forces, and besieging Demetrius in his encampment, into which they had driven them with their arrows, they compelled those that were with him by thirst to deliver up themselves. So they took a great many spoils out of that country, and Demetrius himself, whom they sent to Mithridates, who was then king of Parthia. But as to those whom they took captives of the people of Antioch, they restored them to Antiochus without any reward. Now Mithridates, the king of Parthia, had Demetrius in great honor, till Demetrius ended his life by sickness. So Philip, presently after the fight was over, came to Antioch and took it, and reigned over Syria. Chapter 15. How Antiochus, who was called Dionysus, and after him Aretas, made expeditions into Judea; as also how Alexander took many cities and then returned to Jerusalem, and after a sickness of 3 years died; and what counsel he gave to Alexandra. After this, Antiochus, who was called Dionysus, and was Philip's brother, aspired to the dominion, and came to Damascus, and got the power into his hands, and there he reigned. But as he was making war against the Arabians, his brother Philip heard of it, and came to Damascus, where Milesius, who had been left governor of the citadel, and the Damascenes themselves, delivered up the city to him. Yet because Philip was become ungrateful to him, and had bestowed upon him nothing of that in hopes whereof he had received him into the city, but had a mind to have it believed, that it was rather delivered up out of fear than by the kindness of Milesius, and because he had not rewarded him as he ought to have done, he became suspected by him, and so he was obliged to leave Damascus again. For Milesius caught him marching out into the hippodrome, and shut him up in it, and kept Damascus for Antiochus Eucerus, who hearing how Philip's affairs stood, came back out of Arabia. He also came immediately, and made an expedition against Judea, with 8,000 armed footmen, and 800 horsemen. So Alexander, out of fear of his coming, dug a deep ditch, beginning at Char-Barzaba, which is now Antipatris, to the sea of Joppa, on which part only his army could be brought against him. He also raised a wall, and erected wooden towers, and intermediate redoubts, for 150 furlongs in length, and there expected the coming of Antiochus. But he soon burnt them all, and made his army pass by that way into Arabia. The Arabian king Aretas at first retreated, but afterward appeared on the sudden with 10,000 horsemen. Antiochus gave them the meeting, and fought desperately, and indeed when he had gotten the victory, and was bringing some auxiliaries to that part of his army that was in distress, he was slain. When Antiochus was fallen, his army fled to the village of Cana, where the greatest part of them perished by famine. After him Arims reigned over Celesyria, being called to the government by those that held Damascus, by reason of the hatred they bare to Ptolemy Manius. He also made thence an expedition against Judea, and beat Alexandra in battle, near a place called Adida. Yet did he, upon certain conditions agreed on between them, retire out of Judea. But Alexander marched again to the city of Dios, and took it, and then made an expedition against Essa, where was the best part of Zeno's treasures, and there he encompassed the place with 3 walls. And when he had taken the city by fighting, he marched to Golan and Seleucia. And when he had taken these cities, he, besides them, took that valley which is called the Valley of Antiochus, as also the fortress of Gamala. He also accused Demetrius, who was governor of those places, of many crimes, and turned him out. And after he had spent 3 years in this war, he returned to his own country, when the Jews joyfully received him upon this his good success. Now at this time the Jews were in possession of the following cities that had belonged to the Syrians, and Idumeans, and Phoenicians. At the seaside, Strato's tower, Apollonia, Joppa, Jamhis, Ashdod, Gaza, Athodon, Raphia, and Rhinocolura. In the middle of the country, near to Idumea, Adorn and Marissa. Near the country of Samaria, Mount Carmel and Mount Tabor, Scythopolis and Gadara. Of the country of Gaulonitis, Seleucia and Gabala. In the country of Moab, Heshbon and Medaba, Lemba and Oranus. Galathon, Zoran, the valley of Cilices, and Polo, which last they utterly destroyed, because its inhabitants would not bear to change their religious rites for those peculiar to the Jews. The Jews also possessed others of the principal cities of Syria, which had been destroyed. After this, King Alexander, although he fell into a distemper by hard drinking, and had a quartan ague, which held him 3 years, yet would not leave off going out with his army, till he was quite spent with the labors he had undergone, and died in the bounds of Ragaba, a fortress beyond Jordan. But when his queen saw that he was ready to die, and had no longer any hopes of surviving, she came to him weeping and lamenting, and bewailed herself and her sons on the desolate condition they should be left in, and said to him, "To whom dost thou thus leave me and my children, who are destitute of all other supports, and this when thou knowest how much ill will thy nation bears thee?" But he gave her the following advice, that she need but follow what he would suggest to her, in order to retain the kingdom securely, with her children; that she should conceal his death from the soldiers till she should have taken that place. After this she should go in triumph, as upon a victory, to Jerusalem, and put some of her authority into the hands of the Pharisees, for that they would commend her for the honors she had done them, and would reconcile the nation to her, for he told her they had great authority among the Jews, both to do her to such as they hated, and to bring advantages to those to whom they were friendly disposed. For that they were then believed best of all by the multitude, when they speak any severe things against others, though it be only out of envy at them. And as he said that it was by their means that he had incurred the displeasure of the nation, whom indeed he had injured. "Do thou, therefore," he said, "when thou art come to Jerusalem, send for the leading men among them, and show them my body, and with great appearance of sincerity, give them leave to use it as they themselves please, whether they will dishonor the dead body by refusing it burial, as having severely suffered by my means, or whether in their anger they will offer any other injury to that body. Promise them also that thou wilt do nothing without them in the affairs of the kingdom. If thou dost but say this to them, I shall have the honor of a more glorious funeral from them than thou couldst have made for me. and when it is in their power to abuse my dead body, they will do it no injury at all, and thou wilt rule in safety." So when he had given his wife this advice, he died, after he reigned 27 years, and lived 50 years within one. Chapter 16. How Alexandra, by gaining the goodwill of the Pharisees, retained the kingdom 9 years, and then, having done many glorious actions, died. So Alexandra, when she had taken the fortress, acted as her husband had suggested to her, and spake to the Pharisees, and put all things into their powers, both as to the dead body, and as to the affairs of the kingdom, and thereby pacified their anger against Alexander, and made them bear good will and friendship to him, who then came among the multitude, and made speeches to them, and laid before them the actions of Alexander, and told them that they had lost a righteous king. And by the commendation they gave him, they brought them to grieve, and to be in heaviness for him, so that he had a funeral more splendid than had any of the kings before him. Alexander left behind him 2 sons, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, but committed the kingdom to Alexandra. Now as to these 2 sons, Hyrcanus was indeed unable to manage public affairs, and delighted rather in a quiet life. But the younger, Aristobulus, was an active and bold man, and for this woman herself, Alexandra, she was loved by the multitude, because she seemed displeased at the offenses her husband had been guilty of. So she made Hyrcanus high priest, because he was the elder, but much more because he cared not to meddle with politics, and permitted the Pharisees to do everything, to whom also she ordered the multitude to be obedient. She also restored again those practices which the Pharisees had introduced, according to the traditions of their forefathers, and which her father-in-law, Hyrcanus, had abrogated. So she had indeed the name of the regent, but the Pharisees had the authority. For it was they who restored such as had been banished, and set such as were prisoners at liberty, and to say all at once, they differed in nothing from lords. However, the queen also took care of the affairs of the kingdom, and got together a great body of mercenary soldiers, and increased her own army to such a degree, that she became terrible to the neighboring tyrants, and took hostages of them. And the country was entirely at peace, excepting the Pharisees. For they disturbed the queen, and desired that she would kill those who persuaded Alexander to slay 800 men, after which they cut the throat of one of them, Diogenes, and after him they did the same to several, one after another, till the men that were the most potent came into the palace, and Aristobulus with them, for he seemed to be displeased at what was done. And it appeared openly that if he had an opportunity, he would not permit his mother to go on so. These put the queen in mind what great dangers they had gone through, and great things they had done, whereby they had demonstrated the firmness of their fidelity to their master, insomuch that they had received the greatest marks of favor from him, and they begged of her that she would not utterly blast their hopes. As it happened now, that when they had escaped the hazards that arose from their open enemies, they were to be cut off at home by their private enemies, like brute beasts, without any help whatsoever. They also said, that if their adversaries would be satisfied with those that had been slain already, they would take what had been done patiently, on account of their natural love to their governors. But if they must expect the same for the future also, they implored of her a dismission from her service. For they could not bear to think of attempting any method for their deliverance without her, but would rather die willingly before the palace gate, in case she would not forgive them. And that it was a great shame, both for themselves and for the queen, that when they were neglected by her, they should come under the lash of her husband's enemies. For that Aretas, the Arabian king, and the monarchs, would give any reward, if they could get such men as foreign auxiliaries, to whom their very names, before their voices be heard, may perhaps be terrible. But if they could not obtain this their second request, and if she had determined to prefer the Pharisees before them, they still insisted that she would place them every one in her fortresses. For if some fatal demon hath a constant spite against Alexander's house, they would be willing to bear their part, and to live in a private station there. As these men said thus, and called upon Alexander's ghost for commiseration of their already slain, and those in danger of it, all the bystanders brake into tears. But Aristobulus chiefly made manifest what were his sentiments, and used many reproachful expressions to his mother, saying, Nay, indeed, the case is this, that they have been themselves the authors of their own calamities, who have permitted a woman who, against reason, was mad with ambition, to reign over them, when there were sons in the flower of their age fitter for it. So Alexandra, not knowing what to do with any decency, committed the fortresses to them, all but Hyrcania and Alexandrium and Machaerus, where her principal treasures were. After a little while also, she sent her son Aristobulus with an army to Damascus against Ptolemy, who was called Menneus, who was such a bad neighbor to the city. But he did nothing considerable there, and so returned home. About this time news was brought that Tigranes, the king of Armenia, had made an irruption into Syria with 500,000 soldiers, and was coming against Judea. This news, as may well be supposed, terrified the queen and the nation. Accordingly, they sent him many and valuable presents, as also ambassadors, and that as he was besieging Ptolemais, for Selene the queen, the same that was also called Cleopatra, reigned then over Syria, who had persuaded the inhabitants to exclude Tigranes. So the Jewish ambassadors interceded with him, and entreated him that he would determine nothing that was severe about their queen or nation. He commended them for the respects they paid him at so great a distance, and gave them good hopes of his favor. But as soon as Ptolemais was taken, news came to Tigranes, that Lucullus, in his pursuit of Mithridates, could not light upon him, who was fled into Iberia, but was laying waste Armenia, and besieging its cities. Now when Tigranes knew this, he returned home. After this, when the queen was fallen into a dangerous distemper, Aristobulus resolved to attempt the seizing of the government. So he stole away secretly by night, with only one of his servants, and went to the fortresses, wherein his friends, that were such from the days of his father, were settled. For as he had been a great while displeased at his mother's conduct, so he was now much more afraid, lest upon her death, their whole family should be under the power of the Pharisees. For he saw the inability of his brother, who was to succeed the government. Nor was anyone conscious of what he was doing but only his wife, whom he left at Jerusalem with their children. He first of all came to Agaba, where was Galestes, one of the potent men before mentioned, and was received by him. When it was day, the queen perceived that Aristobulus was fled, and for some time she supposed that his departure was not in order to make any innovation. But when messengers came one after another, with the news that he had secured the first place, the second place, and all the places, for as soon as one had begun they all submitted to his disposal, then it was that the queen and the nation were in the greatest disorder, for they were aware that it would not be long ere Aristobulus would be able to settle himself firmly in the government. What they were principally afraid of was this, that he would inflict punishment upon them for the mad treatment his house had had from them. So they resolved to take his wife and children into custody, and keep them in the fortress that was over the temple. Now there was a mighty conflux of people that came to Aristobulus from all parts, insomuch that he had a kind of royal attendance about him. For in a little more than 15 days he got 22 strong places, which gave him the opportunity of raising an army from Libanus and Trachonitis, and the monarchs, for men were easily led by the greater number, and easily submitted to them. And besides this, that by affording him their assistance, when he could not expect it, they, as well as he, should have the advantages that would come by his being king, because they had been the occasion of his gaining the kingdom. Now the elder of the Jews, and Hyrcanus with them, went in unto the queen, and desired that she would give them her sentiments about the present posture of affairs, for that Aristobulus was in effect lord of almost all the kingdom, by possessing of so many strongholds, and it was absurd for them to take any counsel by themselves, how ill soever she were, whilst she was alive, and that the danger would be upon them in no long time. But she bid them do what they thought proper to be done, that they had many circumstances in their favor still remaining, a nation in good heart, an army, and money in their several treasuries. for that she had small concern about public affairs now, when the strength of her body already failed her. Now a little while after she had said this to them, she died, when she had reigned 9 years, and had in all lived 73. A woman she was who showed no signs of weakness of her sex, for she was sagacious to the greatest degree in her ambition of governing, and demonstrated by her doings at once that her mind was fit for action, and that sometimes men themselves show the little understanding they have by the frequent mistakes they make in point of government. For she always preferred the present to futurity, and preferred the power of an imperious domain above all things, and in comparison of that had no regard to what was good or what was right. However, she brought the affairs of her house to such an unfortunate condition, that she was the occasion of the taking away that authority from it, and that in no long time afterward, which she had obtained by a vast number of hazards and misfortunes, and this out of a desire of what does not belong to a woman, and all by a compliance in her sentiments with those that bear ill will to their family, and by leaving the administration destitute of a proper support of great men. And indeed, her management during her administration while she was alive was such as filled the palace after her death with calamities and disturbance. However, although this had been her way of governing, she preserved the nation in peace. And this is the conclusion of the affairs of Alexandra. End of Book 13, chapters 14 through 16. End of Book 13.